Okay, so we are live now, and I'm going to let people in. Great. I'm just letting a few more people in. And there might be some people coming in a little bit later as well. So welcome everyone to the EcoArt Salon. I'm so glad that you have joined us again this month. And I did want to first, however, note that that we are on the unceded territory with of the Lenape Nation with Rutgers-Newark. And I am actually zooming from upstate New York and on the unceded territory of the Mohawk Nation. And I would like to recognize them and their communities and generations present and past and for the future. And I wanted to also note that I'm Alexandra Chang, just so you know, and that I teach at Rutgers-Newark, and I teach EcoArt, and I see several of my students here. So, and also I teach the Global Asia's Art and Visual Cultures, as well as the Art History Survey course, which I see some people as well from. And I also work at the Price Institute, and am the interim associate director there, as well as the associate director at the American Studies program. I wanted to also note that, you know, this is only the third time that we're doing a virtual engagement. Normally, the EcoArt Salon meets in person. There's about, you know, a dozen to, you know, maybe 20 people. We have dinner together, you know, and we talk and we hang out until the building closes. So that's the kind of, you know, feeling that, you know, many people are kind of missing, is kind of being able to hang out together, having an informal discussion. And we're really hoping that the Eco Salon, Art Salon in this virtual format can also still provide a space that is a bit more friendly, a little bit more about talking to community and building community. And that's why we actually have it every month, because we really hope that people will join us every month. And we also have a format that actually Mary Ting and Shin helped to think through during this time of figuring out what a virtual engagement could be. And so what's going to happen is we're going to talk with both of the artists and have them talk about their work for about, you know, the first part, about 20 minutes each, is, you know, here or there. And then we're going to have some breakout rooms. And so each breakout room will have Jean in one and Mare in the other, and they'll be smaller and folks will be able to talk directly to the artist, and you can share thoughts about the works or the issues or whatever comes up. And so it's meant to be informal. I'm just noting this again. So, so, you know, hopefully like you'll have your videos on, you'll have your, you know, audio on, so you can talk and share ideas. So let me see. Great. I wanted to also recognize that the EcoArt Salon is hosted by the Rutgers University-Newark Paul Robeson Galleries. And we're actually really proud to be co-presenting. Let me just share this. Oh, sorry, just going to, just so you can see. All right, we're co-presenting today with Laser New Brunswick. Great. And just letting people in at Laser New Brunswick. And I wanted to especially extend a thank you for the whole committee of folks working on that, students and faculty, and especially Elizabeth Demarais at Rutgers Camden, who invited us to really be a part of that. And so Leonardo Laser Talks are a program of international gatherings that bring artists, scientists, humanists, and technologists together for informal presentations, performances, and conversations with the wider public. The mission of Laser is to encourage contribution to the cultural environment of a region by fostering interdisciplinary dialogue and opportunities for community building. And that is very much what the EcoArt Salon is about, right? In thinking about the issues that are happening and the artists that are creating and working in New York and New Jersey, but also beyond. And how can we interconnect with the issues that also are very much converging beyond our site here in Newark to sites globally, right? I wanted to also thank the Clement A. Price Institute on Ethnicity, Culture, and the Modern Experience at Rutgers University-Newark for sponsoring the EcoArt Salons too. So for this EcoArt Salon, which is collective healing with Jean Shin and Mary Ting, we really want to think about the importance of community, of grieving and healing interrelated with our current eco-crisis. And so we're going to be talking about their works. Today, I don't know if you saw in the New York Times, there was this article on how parents can tame the stress of climate crisis. I read the title, I was like, oh, I have to read this article. But interestingly, it almost starts off with like, you have to take care of yourself first before you start to take care of others. But underlining that, it's really thinking about, you know, the ideas of anxiety, grief, and mental, physical, and emotional care right now that are constantly seeming to be in the air in this situation with the pandemic, definitely connected to, right, our extractivist practices, right? But then also thinking about mass extinctions, what might have seemed like far away, like over there, which we see in Mary's work, where we'll talk about more how it's connected to the here, right? And then thinking about exotic frogs to rhinos, exotic, you know, and what might be seen as part of our childhood and everyday, such as like bugs disappearing or our backyard birds that are dying off, right? And then we're also experiencing these extreme weather events, from fires to hurricanes, you know, thinking about sea level rise in relationship to that. And then also we're in this moment of like seemingly overly busy and overstressed lives that are, you know, really underlined also by Zoom. I know, sorry. Hopefully this will help you distress a little bit and I'm not like actually making it worse for you. But so at this moment, can we acknowledge and cope with these things that seem to be, you know, out of fiction, but is like piled onto our realities now? And it almost feels like it's overnight, right? But it hasn't been. It's been coming into this collective realization presently. So these are the issues that Mary Ting and Jean Shin are working within and through. And they've been doing this for a while too. And they're not just purely addressing the issues reactively, but really, we'll get to that further, how they're working on these issues. So first I wanted to introduce Mary Ting and talk a little bit with her, and then we'll talk with Jean. So Mary, here, I'm just going to, so Mary is a Chinese American artist. She's a cultural thinker, educator, and writer. Her solo exhibitions include Lambert Foundation, Dean Project, Metaphor Contemporary Art, Kentler Drawing Space, Wake Forest University, North Carolina, and her current retrospective, Our Hive is Sick, at the University of Massachusetts Amherst, Augusta Savage Gallery. Ting has received grants and residencies from the New York Foundation of the Arts, Gottlieb Foundation, Paulette Krasner Foundation, Joan Mitchell Center, NOLA, LMCC, Governor's Island, MacDowell Colony, among others. Some of her highlights have been presentations, Ecological Loss into Action, Plant Cures 2, Residents of the 14th Street Pass, in her upcoming 21st Century Tree of Life project, and her ongoing Daffodil Ashes project. I wanted to also mention that she teaches at the Art Department in Environmental Justice program at John Jay College, and she's a master composter, citizen pruner, and avid gardener as well. So Mary, I don't know if you might be able to share a little bit about your work and how, interestingly, I find like your work is able to touch upon both personal as well as collective grief.
Sure. Thank you so much, Alexandra, for that great introduction. And I'm so excited to be here with everyone. So thank you so much for the invitation. Excited to also be with Jean too as well. I'm going to share my screen. Okay. So, and I decided for today I was going to do something a little different. I'm going to show work that I have never really shown before. Because I realized that it's really important to show the shift. Like, when does it happen that you're able to even talk about grief? And when I was in high school, my last senior year, my first serious boyfriend suddenly died in a car accident. And that was really, really extreme for me, especially as a young person and not really having the means or the community to really grapple with it properly, especially at that age. So I didn't really deal with it, just went on to art school. And it was in my junior year of art school, and I was an illustration maker. So we're always assigned topics, right? So you're told, like, as an art director giving you an assignment. But suddenly in a printmaking class, they're like, use a piece of black paper and white paper and do whatever, right? So it's the first time, whatever, right? So it's hard to see, but this is some pages from a long accordion fold book. So it's black piece of paper, and this is white cutout paper. And what I was trying to do was, throughout that time when I was really at the midst of dealing with his death, because it was very, very sudden. It was overnight, in fact. I was having all these dreams. And, the thing about loss is that one of the main things is suddenly all the stories stop, right? Before then, you always have stories. You were mad at him, you had a fight, you had this, you had that. There were stories, funny, sad, whatever. But suddenly, there's just no more stories. And then the only time where there was a story would be in a dream. So I kept a dream diary. And it was all these kind of grappling with, even in the dream, you can talk, the person's there, but you can't talk to them. And then also the remembering when I first found out and went running out of the house, right? So, so these are cut paper images, and you can see it's abstracted, but there's a person lying there. You see the face here and the hands together. And then there's this landscape, and there's all this chaos. And these are extremes of the landscape. And then here's this person, I don't know if you can tell, it's abstracted amidst all these, this is like an abstraction of cemeteries. And there was even an incident when I went back to the cemetery, and I wanted to put all these flowers there. And I just went by instinct, you just go driving. And then suddenly I couldn't find the grave. And it turns out I was at the wrong cemetery. And then I was sent to another cemetery. I went to 5 cemeteries, I couldn't find the grave. But anyway, so all these things got put into this book while I was in art school. And it was after doing this that I felt a real shift. And what that shift is, it's the first time of transforming some, grief into something tangible. And I felt that was really important. And it was so immense for me at that time. Whether this piece is successful or not, it really didn't even make a difference. It was about that shift inside me and realizing, oh my God, the power of art, that you could try and take something. It's like taking this thing inside you and putting it onto something else. And that was immense. And I realized I'm not going to be an illustrator, right? Because I was always frustrated because I never wanted to really listen to the assignment. And there was always like the section that I liked, that I had to hide inside the piece. So that changed everything. So I felt like it was important to include it. I don't think it's ever been exhibited. And so now I'm going to talk about, again, cultural memory, family. And I feel like almost every piece I've ever done from graduation on in some way deals with grief, because it's always centered around loss. If you think about it, coming from any kind of immigrant family, there's loss of home, there's loss of culture, there's a shift, right? Now, and there's also all this incredible loss of nature that's been going on for decades, centuries. So I always say I was born in a house of silence. That was where the primary language was. It was also a house of incredible wonder, like a wonder cabinet, but there was also an incredible amount of silence and grief. And my mom did tell me some stories about when she was in the Jinling College, and this is the only college where females could go to college in China. And one day suddenly this young boy whose father was a executive in the oil industry. He was an American, and this is in China, in Nanjing. And he came in with a gun and he shot the nesting herons in this incredible campus. It's a Ming Dynasty campus with all these kind of ornate dragons and underground brooks and nesting herons. And my mom was aghast. When he left, she went and she picked up all the bodies, as many as she could carry, with their legs and feet dangling on her arm. And she brought them back to the bio lab and she stuffed them. She stayed up all night long, stuffing as many as she could. It was the only thing she could do to preserve their beautiful bodies. And that always stayed in my mind. So that campus site is where the International Safety Committee was, where they tried to hide all the women from the Japanese army in 1937 during the Nanjing massacre. They weren't successful. The army would come in and grab the girls. But it's then 8 years later or 6 years later that my mom goes to college there, and that site still has the remnants of that history. So there were still the cages. They had turned it into a jail at one point. The cages were still there. They were for humans. So for me, the story of that massacre, which is a different time period, same site, different time period, got meshed into one. So for me, the bodies, whether they were female or the birds, they always were side by side. And so I don't distinguish between whether it's humans or women and violence or nature and violence. It's always been one and the same. And that's been consistent in my work. Here's another version. I also wrote a poem and all this text. So I have all these different versions and different installations that I've done on this. And usually the text goes with the show. And it's hard to say which one came first. Was it the text, the poem, or the art? I don't even remember, because they've all gone through many different variations. I also wanted to talk about, there's a tradition in Chinese folk culture of using paper glass items. And actually I did not grow up with it, but I always knew about it. My mom always felt like you shouldn't play with things that belong to the ghosts. So she didn't partake in it. But it's this notion of that you would send your dearly beloved these items as gifts. And, you know, in today's society, these items are all these kind of luxury goods, like it's a symbol of a sports car or a condo or a Gucci bag or an Apple watch. And so when my mom passed away, I was trying to find something that was beyond, you know, the funeral's over, that's not sufficient. And so, sorry. So I tried to do my own version of that tradition. I did go to the stores and I was just like, oh, my mother would have been appalled because there were always this design of social status kind of things. So the first thing I started to make was when spring came up, her daffodils came up in her garden and she couldn't see it. So I started to make, you know, there's so many different varieties in the garden. There's probably about a dozen. So I was trying to make the different varieties and I was going to burn them and send them to her to say, you know, in the first spring without you. So that was the beginning of, it was a personal project. And then as I was doing it, I'm like making all these different things. I made her brushes. I made her things I didn't get to bake and cook for her, but I'd always wanted to. I'm writing letters to her and I realized, oh, this should be a community project. I shouldn't be crying alone. I should be crying in a group. And what better than strangers, right? It's actually more freeing to cry with strangers than with your family, right? And you can talk about things freely. So that's exactly what I did. And the first rendition of it was at the Rubin Art Museum. I had gotten a grant from LMCC, and there were some incredible things that happened. Someone who was an undercover police officer, who was a police officer, detective, he came in, and this is what he immediately made. He made a bulletproof vest, for a comrade that had fallen. So people, and it's really interesting, it was all non-artists, and people just immediately went to it. It was a 4-week workshop. Some people like switched about what they were going to make. Some people were reluctant to write and they wanted to use like a Walt Whitman poem or something, but with a little nudging. In every case, their stories are incredible. So this apron here was a woman whose mom was a Holocaust survivor. And she talked about her mom's apron and how she put some dictionary pages in there because her mom, English was a second language, and she was always looking at the dictionary. And she made this like to size for her mom. And then all the little pieces of paper that her mom kept and wanted to remember. And this was just a labor of love. And it was made out of thin tissue paper, so it could be burned, or in this case, she felt it made more sense to bury it. And that's what she did. Later on, I did them with my students. You can see this here is a baby bottle. And this was really so, so sad. It was her nephew that had actually been murdered. And the text that went with it was, "I wish I got to meet you." And she also made a skateboard. This was someone's dad's breakfast. The breakfast he had every single morning, which was just coffee. That cup is brimming with coffee and bananas, right? So it's everything that's personal. This is stir-fried broccoli. This was for her lover who smoked, but she gave her cigarettes with flowers coming out. These were the brushes for my mom. And then we always have a meal in a garden, and either we burn them if you like, or if you want to just take them home or bury them, whatever. It's all up to the person, right? And then what I've been doing is I document them, I photograph them, and it's a collection of the universality and all the different variations on grief. And then everyone bonds because we've spent this time together. Another one that, speaking of groups, is that I've really learned so much from my students, and they aren't art makers. Some of them are art minors, but there's so much power in a group. That what happens when you sit together and you're making things, and you're also doing it in a non-competitive way, so that instead of like, oh, mine is better than yours, it's kind of like, let's help each other figure out how to do this. So in their first projects, which are always like this recycled cardboard, and we make animals, I did end up, they participated in an exhibition when I was really starting to research all this about driving extinction and the Chinese market for endangered species products. So I had 2 installations of my students' work. And that also I felt was like the more the merrier, because then they came and they brought their friends, and it's really extending awareness. So this is kind of like my thinking for the exhibition, was that I had all this local press and interviews. I ran all the programs, so it's like using everything I'd ever done in the past, and now I'm like putting it to use again, whether it's arts and ed programs, public programming. I brought in a traditional Chinese medicine doctor to talk about these medicinal products that use endangered species, or raw materials that could push a species into a danger point, such as shark fin, bear bile, and things like that. So it's having discussions. I also brought in a Chinese dance troupe as well to broaden it. We played Wild Aid videos. It was the whole gamut. We had a Buddhist Lama talk as well. And then from all these things, it started to influence me in my work. And I was trying to think of different ways that I could explain this. And so this is a statue I grew up with. The Squiney Statue was always in our house. It was actually bought for the house, and because, I was the youngest, the new baby, and to protect the house. Unfortunately, it's also made out of ivory, And my mom, who was a biology major, thought that, you know, ivory, she said, well, our ivory is from the elephant cemetery. And then she would go on about how wonderful elephants are and how they grieve. And therefore they would take their bones and their tusks and bring them to a very special sacred place that only the elephants knew. So this is all myth and total fallacy. You can also find it in The Lion King as well. And there's even an elephant cemetery song. So Disney is still continuing this myth. So I put together, this is my mom's paintings. My mom worked in a hospital, but she always painted. So this is her painting. And I felt like this was a typical traditional Chinese painting, all that love of nature and that beauty, right? The waterfall and the water. And then photoshopped it with the ivory. And Guanyin she is the deity of compassion and mercy. And every Chinese person loves her, right? Because she perceives and hears the cry of everyone in need. And, you know, it's very often that mothers will say to their children, and that's what's written here, is that when you have compassion and mercy in your heart, then life is so much fuller, right? So I felt it was appropriate to put that with the image so that people could really, especially this is really geared for the Chinese person, so they could put it together. And then this image, I actually contacted Andrew Tucalo, and this is from an elephant herd that she had been studying for years and had actually been massacred for their ivory. Here's another one, and this one is of another Buddha statue that was also in our home, and he's known as the laughing Buddha or the smiling Buddha. And it's really, why is he laughing? You know, it's been co-opted now into like all this commercialness, and sometimes you see him surrounded by coins, and people say things like, oh, rub his tummy and you'll have good luck or you get money. But really he's laughing and smiling out of generosity, right? Out of the good, right? That you're being generous. So, you know, things have been so shifted in modern culture. And here it was just decided that it was just that he's laughing, right? So is he laughing at sarcasm? It's really, is he laughing at the horror of the slaughter here, these carcasses, because he knows that the price of ivory will go up? Which is the reality of as elephants get scarcer, right? Then it's even more desirable because it's an even rarer commodity. And that is actually what was pushed when the market went crazy, was that it was considered like a win-win as a commodity. It was considered gold, ivory, and that was the advertising, even on Chinese state media. Also, you know, again, looking into my life personally, I made this piece that was called Evidence of a Questionable Life. And it's essentially, it's like a witch trial. So it's like taking my personal life and family and putting objects as if they're like, you know, in plastic bags for a trial. And it started when I was in China for 3 years, and I was making stuff and there was always putting it in plastic bags so I could travel easily with it. And then at that time I called it Records of Sadness. But eventually it turned into this format. And this is still growing. And this is one of the things, it's a picture of Babaoshan, which is the Hall of Revolutionary Heroes. This is supposed to be where you're buried, quote unquote, or your ashes are if you're a revolutionary hero in Beijing. But in the case of my family, their bodies were tossed. In the case of my uncle, and he was purged in 1968 and forced to commit suicide. He was also the founder of the National Academy of Sciences, the founder of the physics department at Fudan University and Beijing University. He was a physicist. And during the Cultural Revolution was purged. My grandfather, I believe his ashes are actually here. But he was a student activist, was always kicked out of the colleges, had to come up with a new name so he could get back into another college, and was jailed for 2 years. Then later on declared a hero This is my uncle, who also was purged when he went back to China, also a physicist. So it's re-looking at history and how, depending on what the time period is, you could be like a witch. You could be someone that's problematic, right? Just like a witch trial is. So that whole piece was about, it's really about the specific time. And, you know, one minute you're a traitor, another minute you're, you know, a revolutionary hero. And that, I think, is still to this day that subject to the winds, the political winds. This is also in that piece. There are also sculptures and things that I made, but I'm just showing you things that are really related to the grief aspect. So my uncle, it's only very, very recently that you can even talk about how he really died in China. And that's only very recently that Beijing University outright says it now. Before then, no. And there is this internet site where you can post anonymously, and we discovered that there's one from my uncle. So this is all virtual, and that, you know, if you click onto this site, people were saying things that they had never been able to say before in China. And I found out about it, sent it to my cousin in Beijing, and he was shocked. He was like, oh my God, this is the first time ever that people are telling the truth. And then he discovered that there was one for his dad too as well. So this is sort of major and the positive of the internet, that there's a place where people can put this, again, taking it off of yourself internally and putting it somewhere where others can see it. Then on the issue of consumption, but also parlaying with the whole Joss object things, remember I said that it's about social status items. Well, also, I found that in New York City, the Joss stores that are near the funeral homes, that there's a lot of these luxury food items. And this one is the gold coin swim bladder. And this bladder of this large fish, at the height of all this demand, was going for 30,000 a bladder. So you can imagine it is pushing species extinction, not just for the totoaba, but the bahaba and the vaquitas. So these two are the ones with the big bladder, but this poor little vaquita happens to swim in the same waters. And this is Mexican California waters. At this point, definitely extinction. I've been to 2 different conferences where they already declared it extinct, but I think it's like 17, 15 left in the world at this point. But it's completely related to this social status item. And I think in most cases, it's not even eaten anymore. It's for this, it's really a commodity. It's almost like, it's like gold, it's traded. Or if it was to be eaten, it would be at this banquet where you're really showing it off, that you can have such an item on your dinner table. Here's another one. I mean, I have a whole series of these, but I'm just highlighting 2. So all I've done is, this is the item that you buy from the store. It came in a set of all these conspicuous consumption food items. And then I just added the gold, I put some translations in, and there's nothing inside of it when you actually buy it from the store. So I added a tray so that what's revealed is the problem with this product. That this marketing of this product, which is about 2,000 years old, but in recent years it went wild, and now it's like in 20 flavors and at least 5 different formats. And the latest craze is that it can come in rose flavor, and it comes in crackers and liquid and pill, and you name it, it comes in it. And it's good for your skin, it's good for virility. But what it's done is that it's the Chinese donkeys are not sufficient, and so it's wiping out donkeys across the world. Every nation that has a donkey population is in trouble and has been in trouble for years. So it's worth more dead than alive. So people are actually stealing each other's donkeys, skinning them, and then selling the skins, right? And there's environmental issues. There's so many issues with this. And of course, what you're doing is it's affecting the community. In Malawi, there's a phrase, if you don't have a donkey, you are the donkey. So having a donkey raises the status of women. It raises their, the state of their living standard. Without a donkey, you are the donkey. So, all this has ended up from the art, has ended up me doing a lot of research. And I've been doing presentations really just about the demand issue. And I sort of intersperse some art, but I really talk about history and what got us there, which is really politics, and less about culture and more about politics and marketing. And so that's led to so many different things. It started out in Nepal. I was also on a lecture tour in South Africa, as well as many other places. And also thinking about workshops for the future that also pulls in what I learned from prior projects, that when you're in a group, it crosses so many different boundaries. There isn't this kind of like blue or red, you know, Republican or Democrats, right? When you're making things together, you've got a common cause, and then you can have dialogues. It's really effective. So I want to do a whole series. I was hoping to do some in Uttarakhand, in India in spring, and then also in Mozambique, but that all ended with didn't happen with the pandemic, but I'm still hopeful, or we could do some things via Zoom. So, and then lastly, just a mention about the show, you know, I feel like all the work in some way touches upon loss. And then just ending with it really, as we see in the pandemic, this is an issue that we cannot be silent about. And it is really a call to action, taking that grief, addressing it personally, and then bringing it into a real community action. So thank you very much.
Okay, great. Thank you so much, Mary, for that. It was amazing to see how you're able to tie like family, tradition, heritage, culture, and you know the ties, the global ties with the animal trade and marketing, poaching, and extinction and grieving together. That was an amazing journey we just went through with what you were talking about. I wanted to pull in Jean Shin now to talk a little bit about her work, and then I'll ask you a few questions. Jean, welcome. And she was born in Seoul, South Korea, and raised in the US, and lives and works in Brooklyn in upstate New York. Are you upstate right now? Is that okay? Same with me. And she also teaches fine art at Pratt, and she has served on the board of the Joan Mitchell Foundation and the National Young Arts Foundation. And she's very well known for her monumental installations that transform everyday objects into elegant expressions of identity and community engagement. She's had many solo shows in spaces such as Museum of Modern Art, Smithsonian American Art Museum, Philadelphia Museum of Art, Asian Art Museum. And she's been featured in many, many exhibitions as well. And she completed an amazing commission at the MTA's 2nd Avenue subway at 63rd Street station in Manhattan. So if you haven't seen it yet, go and see it, if you can, with a mask. And also, she has received the Paula Krasner Foundation grant, ACC Fellowship, NIFA Fellowship, among many others. Thank you so much for being here. I wanted to just kind of initially, let me just talk about a little bit about your work, because I think it's so interesting in how you're able to tie community and people together, folks that might not realize they're interrelated or connected, but you know they are, and you're able to kind of pull that veil that we all are kind of like blinded by, and many times it's purposefully blinded by, you know, either the government or marketing or industry, and you're able to do this, you know, and also have people understand like not only this tie, but be able to then, for example, think about our ecological degradation of plastics, of consumption and waste. And I was wondering, because this is like a large trajectory you've been doing. I mean, this has been years that you've been doing this, and it's been intensifying, and like the amazing installations that you have been able to do. And so I was wondering, like, is this something like early on you recognized that you wanted to do this? Is that how you started, or? Oh, let me unmute.
Sorry. Thank you so much, both for bringing us together to have this really important conversation. And your question is interesting to me, just because I think as a young artist, like it's very personal, and so you make a connection and you activate things in your life. And I think that's very similar to how Mary spoke about her work. It's later that, like, retrospectively, I could talk about it. Oh, that makes sense. That makes sense. I sort of rationalize what I was doing and continue to do. But it is just an optimism, I think, is just trying to be able to survive and transform what you have. And it wasn't intentional in that way. It was instinctual. Like, these are the things I have. I want to make things. I want to do things, but this is what I have. And so you work with what you have and then you transform them. And it's through your imagination that it connects to all these other big issues that you may or may not be consciously aware that you're doing. So now, of course, when I'm in project mode and thinking about proposals and speaking to other people about why invest and do this project with me and trying to get collaborations, then it's that I am trying to extract and bring those connections in mind and to try to have as many resources and hands on deck to build together. But that is the strategy that I think in the beginning was really just the curiosity that led me to do the things I wanted to do.
That's great. And it's interesting how, like, the context that you are in specific sites or or materials, right, inform like your connection to the major issues that are happening globally and around you, right? Last time I saw you in person was at Storm King, I think. And you had created the LA Gathering there. And I was wondering if you might be able to talk about it in terms of your trajectory of work, because it seems to stand out in a way in terms of gathering people, because you gather materials and this one kind of gathers people. And then I'd love for you to then kind of maybe talk a bit about pause, because there's a kind of interrelationship there. But then, of course, in thinking about memory and grief as well with the projects.
Yeah, my objects have been always in some way overlooked or discarded and left over. And so that was actually happening at the sculpture landscape, that they were having to replace their incredible canopy of trees along their LA. So in fact, I did see this as like their throwaway, sadly, these beautiful trees function, gave its life, and now they were dying and suffering. And so to revamp the landscape and to reintroduce it and revitalize it, they made a decision to cut them all down. And so, of course, to me, that seems, as painful. I heard the news, of course, they had to make this decision, and it seemed incredibly painful to realize. So I wanted to salvage that. And I also wanted to talk in terms of, like, we don't just get rid of things. We need to acknowledge what we're doing, trying to open up a conversation around transparency. What has happened here? And then what does it mean to us? And so I wanted to preserve those trees instead of having them disappear into the landscape, to hold them as I can in the momentary exhibition. So I created this large communal sculpture. And part of it was people who go to Storm King love it for its landscape and natural setting for art, and I wanted the art to be nature, and an homage to nature, and also a memorial, because these trees disappearing was something I wanted to, like a funeral and memorial, to gather, to remember what it gave, what its life was like. So that's why the whole gathering idea, that it wasn't that I needed to collect things from the community. The community was going to feel not these objects, but these living things that are no longer with us. So that was a little bit of a shift, I think, than my typical strategy of working with the community to get the materials. It was here. I wanted them to community to gather here to see the loss of their trees and the landscape. I'm going to talk a little bit about pause in my images, so maybe they'll have a visual context.
Okay. Did you want to perhaps show some of the works?
Yeah, would that be okay?
Yeah, that'd be great.
Okay. So, part of, I was also prompted to talk about our idea of the collective healing. And so I wanted to talk about some of my process, which is that I do work site specifically. And you mentioned Storm King as a site. And I was thinking about this. Of course, we're all been anxiously thinking about the election and this site in particular. And to me, it's Washington, D.C. is not really a monument of who is the leader who's going to lead us, but how it affects the people and this idea of the collective notion. So I bring one of the images from my research where I was really struck about this void, and the National Mall was a site where it was empty. And it was so beautiful to imagine that before urban designers really thought of leaving space. And I think that's a trajectory that I see a common in my work, because what do you do when you leave space? Well, it gets filled by people who could come together and protest, but also all to revel and celebrate. And I think we was on the edge of both, right? During this sense of anxiety that we were feeling and the collective healing that needed to happen during this election. And of course, the work that needs to happen. And of course, the work isn't that we elected this person or this person lost. It's really about how do we come together? How do we fill that space, the void? And so these are trophies that I collected and bringing together these ideas of the everyday monument, the monument to the everyday hero, which I thought was not really our leader, but oftentimes the people that we overlook, who's, fixing our car or, serving us food. And these conversations became so important, as we call them, essential workers. But we used to, nurses, doctors, the teachers, all these people who just seem to actually make things work for us, who are not acknowledged and named. And so these are the trophies that I make for them. And this onlooking, the people who look at this kind of fetishization of them, but in fact, they are doing the work and never often seen and often invisible. And that connects, of course, to immigrants and the kind of whose work is valued and appreciated and paid. And the same conversation would go to feminism, so it's just trying to acknowledge that work. I'm also thinking about wellness, and I think collective healing really deals with wellness is not only just health and medication, but just who has access to that, and how we think of quick fixes like medication and Western ideas of medicine versus the long-term, everyday hard work of eating right, exercising, that sort of complexity. And that leads to some of these ideas around what objects we consume and food. And food is the basis of nutrition, and yet we eat and drink empty calories. So these are the community-based projects where I need a lot of labor, but the labor can then be shared, just like Mary's practice, working with students, inviting them to make art, and not just any version of it, but one that would be displayed in the museum and be part of the work. So these are corn stalks, all made out of Mountain Dew bottles. Mountain Dew is one of those culprits that take corn syrup, high fructose corn syrup, and makes it incredibly addictive and toxic for our bodies to consume. And so I made a whole field of corn, thinking about the landscape at Iowa, the highest corn producers, and how much they have changed the American landscape. And this corn production has become like an agricultural level scale that has lost its biodiversity. And of course, its effect on the environment from every level to our bodies, but to the larger ecosystem. And then I had this chance to present this work in New York. And this site at the Winter Garden, I was amazed that this beautiful canopy architectural space has palm trees growing in it. And I thought, what an anomaly that we have palm trees growing in New York, as if we're going to preserve this. And I thought it was kind of a mirage, it's our fantasy space of desire, not the reality of this. And so introducing corn seemed like, well, what does that have to do with New York? But, oftentimes we don't acknowledge, like you said, the lands. This was farm country. This is where native maize would be grown. if we look very carefully at the histories. But instead, we have Mountain Dew and processed foods everywhere, and that is the food that's usually accessible, and healthy foods that we need to eat, or natural foods. So that blurring between what's natural and what's artificial, these paradoxes that we live in, because we're marketed as if Mountain Dew seems like it's sort of natural. It's so green. It's actually greener than the palm trees, greener than things that are really alive. And that palm tree isn't really supposed to be sustainable in this environment. So that goes to the containers. It's the bottle industries. It's the people who are making money off this drink. And so the plastic waste is something that doesn't get recycled and end up in the waste stream. So this is another project that I showed in conjunction, which is called The Last Straw. And you can imagine the litigation to try to ban things like The Last Straw. But in fact, there's so much plastic waste. Single-use plastic is everywhere. And I think now at the pandemic, we realize the disposable masks, like, where do they go? And there's so many people who are not aware that they end up in our ocean. So these are straws that are like taking from our oceans and arriving and disappearing and not visible. So these are ideas around like the ocean becoming filled and made from another material, plastics and so on. This is from another project with Soundwave, just thinking about what's visible and what's invisible. And sound is something that we think is not physically possible to understand, but the magnitude of its capabilities is incredible to think about, like a tsunami. So we have this exhibition that you mentioned, Pause, and ironically, it opened in February, right before the whole shutdown of our country and throughout the world, with what we were calling the Great Pause. What I meant by pause was that I wanted to stop thinking about our phones as being such a connector or driver to our social connections, but instead to think about the physicality in which we live and wanting people to connect, putting down their phones. But in fact, these are all recycled phones from an e-waste that we partnered with in the local area. And so it becomes an archive of all the like 20 years of mobile devices, from the flip phone to moving to the smartphone, and how when they're functioning, they're our vehicle to the world. And then when we want to upgrade and just kind of constantly chase after the novelty of the next technology, we forget that these phones have a life and they have to go somewhere. They often end up becoming part of the larger landscape. And so this is all the kind of the e-waste that we don't consider when we're upgrading our phones. And our need for technology right now is the only way we're connecting, but for us to start questioning all of those things, that is it helping us or is it actually hurting us? And what is the larger cost for all of this addictive behaviors and consumption that we're practicing today? Maybe I'll end there so we can continue our conversation.
Okay, thank you so much, Jean. It's amazing to be able to hear about the trajectory of your work and what you are working on now. And I was wondering, a question to both you and to Mary about really creating space for people to take a pause, as you have done, to take a moment to sit at the picnic table, right? And for Mary, to be able to connect with others, right? To take that moment to actually let go in a way that, through artwork. How do you see, for example, us being able to access this kind of project, or really support this kind of project on different levels? Because I'm thinking like it'd be great to have projects like this on campus now to provide space, right, for students or a community. Do you find that it's harder to do these types of projects because of maybe the logistics required and all, it's not something that you can, like, you're not selling like a sculptural item perhaps, or, it's part process that is so important. I wonder if you might be able to just talk about, accessibility, how we might be able to have more of these types of projects in which you are creating these exceptionally needed spaces right now.
Mary, do you want to take that on?
Either one, maybe we should both.
Okay.
Start. I think we both probably have slightly different perspectives. You want to go ahead?
Oh, I was just saying, in some way, I am lucky to have had that support on these grand scales for commissioning the work, and whether it's the MTA, the federal government, these museums. But honestly, it comes back to paying attention to what's around you. I mean, that's what the prompt is. Look around. Slow down and really pay attention to some detail of your surroundings, the real things that matter, and not be chasing over whatever is not happening around you, And I think that's really hard in today's sort of social media space around the screen, because something is always happening somewhere, and that's amazing, but we always feel like we're missing out on something as opposed to the thing that's really happening here and now. And so I actually think, well, there's a shutdown, like you can just make art. And you don't have to be anywhere. You don't have to show the art in any sort of fancy institution, that you don't need that support necessarily. You just make art because you want to, because you wanted to spend the time. So I think it's really about our time economy, that we're like, let's reclaim that. Right. And it's not the scale issue. And it's about like, keep it accessible, keep it safe. Right. It doesn't mean now we need to aim for thousands of people to see a work. It's actually just, spaced out one at a time, 6 people, 6 feet apart, So I feel like everything has changed and shifted in scale. And I think that's a beautiful shift. And I'm really optimistic about that. Like, I'm sure we can use that to our advantage, as opposed to seeing it as being robbed of or lack of. Actually having intimate conversations, wouldn't that be lovely? One at a time, maybe. Isn't that great? So I do think we just have to honor and see the value of it, and to truly commit to that value versus seeing it for what it's not,
Great, thank you. Mary, did you want to say anything?
Sure. Yeah, I mean, I really agree with Jean about, it's really about how you look at possibilities, what you think is a possibility. It's all a perspective, right? And it's also about the ego too, because it doesn't always have to be, the monument. And you think about it, during the time of the pandemic, we all have windowsills. I mean, we all have these ways that we could be showing the world, and it doesn't always have to be online. It could just be in our window, on our door. And then, with stores going out of business or stores not functioning, then there are all these like window displays. And that's also another place where we could be putting work in that would have a lot more visibility. So I think that it's really a perspective, and that, it's funny, since the pandemic, and I'm cooking slightly differently, and I'm like, my shopping slightly different. And I'm noticing there is more plastic in, I mean, normally I have very little, right? And I like pride myself on having as zero waste as possible, but like suddenly there's like more. And I was really upset with myself. And I even joined this zero waste group that's coming out of India, and they're like, everyone's like weaving all their plastic and making rugs and doing all these, like everyone makes everything, right? They make their detergent, their soap, their everything. So, I mean, there's that too, that you get inspired and you can learn via all these platforms and spread it. So the whole thing is that on that group, you all have to share what you have created or made. So I have been accumulating all this plastic, and it's for a piece. But I think that, again, it's perspective. And one of the good things I see about that's changing in the art world is I think I'm hoping that there's a shift a little bit away from the artist's ego and more into the reality of our times and what is important. Our hive is sick. What are we going to do? What is important? What type of work really has meaning? What type of work do you want to go look at to feel something about humanity, right? Versus the commerce world. So yeah, I think and also you can make you can make situations. I know that there's less funding out there now, and there's less, but you can also make situations and find project in unexpected places. So it's not just a standard fare. I think that's really the key, is to be more creative about where you look to put something.
Excellent. Thank you both so much. I'm actually going to end the questions right now because I would love for people to be able to go into the breakout sessions and have the 20 minutes to be able to do that. And then we'll come back and we can talk some more. So I just wanted to say also bye to the folks that have been viewing this on Facebook streaming, because they won't be able to join us in the breakout rooms. But hopefully, you know, if you want to join next month, you can RSVP to the Zoom. And then for the Zoom people, we'll be joining these groups shortly. So hold on one second.